scorn. That was the only thing heavier than the heat in Oakhaven, Wyoming, the day Loretta Higgins walked down the aisle. The townsfolk didn't throw rice. They threw insults masked as whispers. She was the town's fallen jewel, the daughter of a ruined merchant, seemingly selling herself to a savage to escape destitution. He was Gideon Cross, a man who spoke to no one, wore buckskins that had seen too many winters, and was rumored to live like a wolf in the high peaks. The saloon patrons had placed bets on how long a delicate flower like Loretta would last in his frozen shack. But what the gossips in Oakhaven didn't know, what even Loretta didn't know, was that the man standing at the altar wasn't just a simple mountain man. Underneath the grime and the silence lay the identity of a man hunted by the most powerful syndicate in the East, and he held the deed to a legacy that could buy their entire town 10 times over. The year was 1884, and the dust in Oakhaven tasted like failure. For Loretta Higgins, it coated the back of her throat as she stood in the center of her father's general store, or what was left of it. The shelves, once stocked with calico bolts and tins of peaches, were bare. The only thing filling the room now was the suffocating presence of Thaddeus Blackwood. Thaddeus was a man who sucked the air out of a room just by entering it. He was the owner of the Gilded Spur Saloon and the Blackwood Bank, effectively owning the mortgage on every soul in the valley. He ran a thumb over his waxed mustache, his eyes raking over Loretta in a way that made her want to scrub her skin with lye. "The numbers don't lie, Loretta," Thaddeus said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He tapped the ledger on the counter. "Your father, God rest his foolish soul, wasn't much for bookkeeping. He borrowed against the store, against the house, even against the horse. You owe the bank $4,000. You have until noon tomorrow." Loretta gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. She was 22, with hair the color of roasted chestnuts and eyes that refused to weep, though her world was collapsing. "I can sell the remaining stock. I can work. I'm a seamstress." Thaddeus laughed, a dry, barking sound. "A seamstress? In Oakhaven? You'd have to stitch until your fingers fell off to pay the interest alone." "No, my dear. I have a better proposition." He stepped closer, invading her space. The scent of expensive bay rum and stale cigar smoke wafted off him. "Marry me," he said, though it sounded less like a proposal and more like a foreclosure notice. "You become Mrs. Blackwood. The debt is forgiven. You live in the manor on the hill. You'll never want for anything again." Loretta felt a cold pit in her stomach. Everyone knew what happened to Thaddeus's first 2 wives. One fell down the stairs. The other died of a broken heart and a bottle of laudanum. He was a monster in a silk vest. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Thaddeus's smile vanished. "Then the sheriff evicts you at noon. And since you have no family and no money, you'll end up working at the Gilded Spur. And I don't mean serving drinks." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He tipped his hat and walked out, the spurs on his boots chiming like funeral bells. Loretta collapsed onto a crate, burying her face in her hands. She had no options. The town had turned its back on her since her father's gambling debts came to light. The good Christian women of Oakhaven viewed her poverty as a moral failing. The bell above the door jingled. Loretta quickly wiped her eyes and stood up, smoothing her apron. "I'm sorry, we're closed." She stopped. Standing in the doorway was a figure that blocked out the afternoon sun. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to span the doorframe. He wore a coat made of bear fur, despite the heat, and beneath the brim of a battered hat, a pair of piercing blue eyes stared out from a face obscured by a thick, dark beard. It was the mountain man, the one they called Silent Gideon. He came to town only twice a year to trade furs for gunpowder and salt. The children ran from him. The men mocked him when he was out of earshot, calling him a simpleton, a brute, a wild thing more beast than man. He walked to the counter, his movements quiet for such a large man. He placed a heavy burlap sack on the wood. It hit with a dull thud. "I need salt," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder in a canyon. It sounded rusty, as if he hadn't used it in weeks. We don't have much left," Loretta stammered. She was intimidated, but unlike Thaddeus, Gideon didn't look at her with greed. He looked at her with a strange, intense curiosity. He pushed the sack forward. "For the debt," Loretta blinked. "What? I heard him!" Gideon said, jerking his head toward the door where Thaddeus had exited. "The snake. He wants to buy you." "He wants to marry me," Loretta corrected, shame coloring her cheeks. "Same thing to a man like that," Gideon grunted. He opened the sack. Inside wasn't gold dust or coins. It was high-grade silver nuggets, raw and unpolished, mixed with intricate beaver pelts that were worth a small fortune in the city. Take it to the bank. Pay him. Loretta stared at the pile. Why? Why would you do this? I don't even know you. Gideon looked down at his rough, scarred hands. I need a wife. Loretta's breath hitched. Was this just another trap? Another man trying to buy her? I don't understand, she whispered. Not like him, Gideon said sharply, his blue eyes meeting hers. I don't want a servant. I don't want a trophy. I need help. Winter is coming. It's hard up there. I need someone to manage the cabin, cook, cure the hides. In exchange, you get safety, food, and the debt is gone. He paused, then added, I won't touch you. Not unless you ask. You have my word. It was insanity. Marry the wild man? Go live on the jagged peaks of the Tetons? But she looked at the door where Thaddeus had stood. The brothel or the mountain. A monster she knew, or a beast she didn't. She looked at Gideon Cross. Beneath the beard and the grime, she saw something she hadn't seen in Thaddeus's eyes. Honesty. Okay, she breathed. I'll do it. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a drunken justice of the peace who could barely suppress his laughter. The news had spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. The Higgins girl is marrying the bear. The entire town had turned out, not to wish them well, but to watch the spectacle. Thaddeus Blackwood stood at the back of the courtroom, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He had been outbid by a savage. I give it a week, shouted a man from the saloon, Jeter Fry, as Gideon and Loretta walked out onto the wooden boardwalk. She'll freeze to death or he'll feed her to his wolves. Laughter erupted. Women clutched their shawls, whispering loudly about how far the mighty had fallen. Going to live in a cave? Loretta? One woman sneered. Don't forget to wipe your feet on the dirt. Loretta kept her chin high, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. She wore her best Sunday dress, a pale blue cotton that looked ridiculous next to Gideon's buckskins. She carried a single carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. Gideon didn't say a word. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Thaddeus. He simply took Loretta's elbow, his grip firm but surprisingly gentle, and guided her to his wagon. It wasn't a carriage. It was a rugged, reinforced buckboard wagon drawn by two massive mules that looked as mean as the mountain itself. Gideon lifted her onto the seat as easily as if she were a doll. As he climbed up beside her, Thaddeus stepped off the boardwalk, blocking the path of the mules. You think you've won, boy? Thaddeus spat, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. You think you can take what's mine? Gideon looked down from the wagon seat. For a moment, the dull, simple look in his eyes vanished. His posture shifted, his spine straightening with a military precision that went unnoticed by everyone except Thaddeus. She isn't property, Blackwood, Gideon said. The diction was perfect, crisp, not the slur of a mountain hermit. Step aside. Thaddeus blinked, confused by the sudden change in tone, but Gideon snapped the reins before the banker could respond. The mules lunged forward, forcing Thaddeus to jump into the mud to avoid being trampled. The town roared with laughter again, this time at Thaddeus, but Loretta sat rigid, staring straight ahead. The journey up the mountain was grueling. For hours, they climbed switchback trails that clung to the edge of sheer cliffs. The air grew thinner and colder. The pines grew denser. Oakhaven became a speck in the valley below, a distant memory of cruelty. Loretta stole glances at her new husband. He remained silent, his eyes scanning the tree line constantly, as if he expected an ambush. Who was he? Why did he have bags of silver but dress like a beggar? And that moment with Thaddeus, his voice had changed. Are we going to live in a cave? She asked quietly, breaking the silence after 3 hours. Gideon looked at her, and the corners of his eyes crinkled. No caves. Drafty. A shack, then? You'll see. They crested a ridge just as the sun began to set, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of violet and blood orange. Gideon guided the mules through a narrow pass between two massive boulders, a hidden entrance that no one would spot from the main trail. The path opened up into a hidden high-altitude valley, sheltered from the wind by granite walls. And there, sitting in a meadow of wildflowers that defied the altitude, was not a shack. It was a cabin, yes, but larger than any house in Oakhaven. It was built from massive, hand-hewn logs, chinked perfectly against the weather. A stone chimney smoked lazily. There was a fenced garden, a small barn, and a system of wooden troughs bringing fresh spring water right to the door. It was beautiful. This is yours? Loretta gasped. It's ours now, Gideon said, helping her down. But as Loretta walked toward the door, she tripped on a root. Gideon caught her instantly. As his coat fell open, she saw something tucked into the inner pocket of his vest, something that didn't belong to a mountain man. It was a heavy, leather-bound book, and on the spine, stamped in gold leaf that caught the dying light, was a name, Vanderhoven. She knew that name. Everyone in America knew that name. The Vanderhoven Steelworks in Pennsylvania supplied the iron for the railroads that crisscrossed the nation. They were American royalty. Why was a savage in Wyoming carrying a book belonging to the richest family in the East? The interior of the cabin was the second shock of Loretta's new life. She expected dirt floors and piles of furs. Instead, she stepped onto smooth, sanded pine floorboards covered in intricately woven Navajo rugs. There was a cast iron stove that looked brand new, shelves lined with books. Shakespeare, Plato, textbooks on metallurgy and engineering, and a small writing desk in the corner. It was the home of a scholar, not a trapper. The loft is yours, Gideon said, closing the heavy oak door and barring it with a thick beam. I sleep down here near the fire. He began to unbutton his heavy bear fur coat. As he shed the layers, Loretta saw the man beneath. He wasn't the hunched, bulky figure he appeared to be in town. He was lean and powerfully built, wearing a clean flannel shirt and suspenders. He washed his hands in a basin, scrubbing away the town dirt with a ritualistic intensity. You're staring, he said, not unkindly, drying his hands. You have books, Loretta stammered. Classics. In Latin. Long winters, Gideon muttered, turning to check the stove. A man needs to keep his mind sharp. Who are you, Gideon? She asked, her fear giving way to a burning curiosity. You speak like a gentleman when you want to. You live in a fortress. And you paid my debt with silver nuggets as if they were pebbles. Gideon froze. The room went silent, save for the crackle of the fire. He turned slowly to face her. The simple look was entirely gone now. His face was hard, his eyes intelligent and wary. Loretta, he said, using her name for the first time. You are safe here. That is what matters. But you must understand one thing. What you see in this cabin, it stays in this cabin. When we go to town, I am Gideon the trapper. I am the brute. I am the simpleton. Do you understand? Why? Because if people know who I really am, he said quietly, they won't just laugh at us. They will come to kill us. He walked to the window, peering out into the darkening valley. There are men looking for me, men from a life I left behind a long time ago. Thaddeus Blackwood is a nuisance, but the men I'm hiding from, they are sharks. He turned back to her. I needed a wife, Loretta, that part was true. A man goes mad with only silence for company. But I also needed someone the town would dismiss. If I married a strong, capable woman, they'd wonder. But marrying the fallen princess to the town idiot? He offered a grim smile. They look at us and see a joke. And as long as they are laughing, they aren't looking closely. Loretta felt a flash of anger. So I'm just a disguise? Camouflage? No, Gideon said softly. He stepped closer, and for the first time, she felt the magnetic pull of him. I watched you, Loretta. For 2 years, I watched you care for your father when he was sick, even after he gambled your money away. I watched you hold your head up when the women in town spat on your shadow. You have iron in your spine. I need that. I need a partner I can trust with my life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the book she had seen earlier. He placed it on the table. My name is not Gideon Cross, he whispered. I was born William Vanderhoven III, and I am supposed to be dead. Loretta's hand flew to her mouth. The Vanderhoven heir. The newspapers had reported it 5 years ago. A boating accident on the Great Lakes. A body never found. His uncle, Cornelius Vanderhoven, had taken control of the Steel Empire. Your uncle, she whispered. Murdered my father, Gideon said, his voice cold as the wind outside, and tried to murder me to seize the company. I survived, barely. I drifted west, changed my name, and found this place. I found something else here, too, Loretta. Something bigger than steel. He walked to a map pinned to the wall. It was a survey map of the Wyoming Territory. He tapped a section marked in red ink, the land they were standing on. Everyone thinks this mountain is granite and slate, worthless for grazing, too steep for timber. His eyes gleamed. But I'm a metallurgist. I've tested the rock. Loretta, we are sitting on the largest vein of silver and copper west of the Mississippi. It's the Argent King lode. The legends were real. Loretta's head spun. You're rich. I have the potential to be richer than God, he corrected. But I can't file the claim. If I file the claim under the name Gideon Cross, the notoriety will bring the Pinkertons, and they will bring my uncle. And if I file it as Vanderhoven, I'm a dead man walking. He looked at her, his expression vulnerable. I need you, Loretta. I need you to learn the business. I need you to be the face. When the time is right, you will file the claim. You will be the Copper Queen. And I will be your silent guardian. Loretta looked at the man she had married out of desperation. The town laughed at her. Thaddeus pitied her. But this man, this savage, was offering her an empire. And what happens when Thaddeus comes? She asked. Because he will come. He hates losing. Gideon's face hardened into a mask of lethal resolve. He reached above the fireplace and pulled down a Winchester rifle, checking the lever action with a practiced snap. Let him come, Gideon said. The town thinks they know the mountain man. They're about to learn that you don't poke a sleeping bear. The attack came 3 days later, under the cover of a weeping gray dawn. Loretta hadn't slept well since Gideon's revelation. The cabin, once a sanctuary of surprising comfort, now felt like a fortress waiting for a siege. Gideon had spent the days reinforcing the already stout door and strategically placing ammunition boxes near the windows. He moved with a calculated energy that terrified her as much as it reassured her. The mountain man was gone. The Steel Baron's son, trained in military tactics, had taken his place. Stay low, Gideon murmured, kneeling by the east window, his Winchester resting on the sill. And don't fire unless they breach the fence line. Loretta gripped a smaller caliber carbine he had taught her to use. Her hands shook, but her resolve was hardening like mortar. She thought of the town laughing at her, and Thaddeus's greasy smile. She wouldn't go back to being a victim. A shot rang out, shattering the morning silence. A bullet thwacked into the heavy logs of the cabin, inches from the window. 4 of them, Gideon counted calmly, peering through the scope. Thaddeus didn't come himself. He hired the scum from the deeper mining camps. Men who kill for whiskey money. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared. 100 yards down the slope, a man yelped and tumbled from his saddle behind a boulder. The return fire was intense, bullets chewing up the porch railing. Loretta watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Gideon moved from window to window. He didn't shoot wildly like the men below. Every shot he took was measured, breathing out slowly before pulling the trigger. He was a machine of cold efficiency. They're trying to flank us, he said, tossing her his empty rifle. Reload. She fumbled with the cartridges, her fingers slick with sweat, thrusting them into the loading gate as fast as she could while he kept up a steady barrage with her carbine. They worked in tandem, a strange, desperate rhythm forming between them. The attackers, realizing they weren't facing a terrified hermit, grew reckless. 2 men broke cover, sprinting toward the barn, intending to set it ablaze. Gideon didn't even blink. He dropped one with a shot to the knee, and the other scrambled back behind the rocks, terrified by the uncanny accuracy. The gunfire petered out as the sun crested the peaks. The hired guns, realizing they weren't being paid enough to die against a marksman of this caliber, retreated down the switchbacks, leaving their wounded comrades swearing in the dirt. Silence returned to the high valley, heavier than before. Gideon set his rifle down and turned to Loretta. His face was streaked with gunpowder smoke, his eyes blazing blue fire. He looked wilder than any mountain man, a primal force of defense. Are you harmed? He demanded, crossing the room in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders. No, she breathed, heart hammering against her ribs. Gideon, you fought like an army. I told you, he said, his voice rough with adrenaline. What's mine, I keep. He wasn't just talking about the silver. The intensity of his gaze burned away the last remnants of her fear, replacing it with something hotter, something that made her knees weak for an entirely different reason. In the heat of the moment, surviving the violence, the distance between them collapsed. He pulled her close, crushing her against his chest. She smelled gunpowder, pine resin, and the man himself. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle. It was a desperate claiming, a release of years of solitude and days of tension. Loretta kissed him back with equal fervor. She wasn't the ruined shopkeeper's daughter anymore. She was the partner of a dangerous man, standing on a mountain of silver, defending their fortress against the world. A month passed. The snows began to fall in earnest, sealing the high pass to all but the most determined travelers. For Gideon and Loretta, it was a honeymoon period of intense labor and deepening affection. They worked the mine together. Gideon taught her how to identify the richest veins of argentite and bornite ore. Loretta, showing a surprising aptitude for engineering, helped him devise a better pulley system to haul the rock from the depths of the cave system hidden behind the cabin. By night, the cabin was warm with firelight and shared secrets. Gideon spoke of his past life in Pittsburgh, the smoke-choked city of industry, and his ruthless Uncle Cornelius, who saw family only as obstacles to profit. Loretta spoke of her dreams of travel, of seeing the ocean, dreams her father's debts had strangled. They were sitting on a fortune estimated at millions, yet they ate elk stew from tin plates and wore patched wool. It was the happiest Loretta had ever been. But down in Oakhaven, the poison was spreading. Thaddeus Blackwood sat in his private booth at the Gilded Spur, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon and a bruised ego. His hired guns had come back humiliated, spreading tales of the mountain devil who couldn't be missed. Thaddeus knew Gideon wasn't a devil, he was something worse. He was a variable Thaddeus couldn't control. The saloon doors swung open, admitting a blast of frigid air and a stranger who looked entirely out of place in Wyoming. He was tall and rail-thin, wearing a tailored wool coat, a bowler hat, and wire-rimmed spectacles. He carried a leather satchel and walked with the fast, clipped gait of a city man. He didn't look at the working girls or the gambling tables. He walked straight to the bar. "Whiskey," the stranger ordered. His voice was crisp, devoid of any Western drawl. "And information." The bartender glanced at Thaddeus, who nodded slowly. Thaddeus rose and approached the stranger. "We have plenty of both in Oakhaven, friend," Thaddeus said smoothly. "I'm Thaddeus Blackwood. I own this establishment." The stranger turned. His eyes behind the spectacles were pale gray, like frozen sleet. Jasper Thorne, Pinkerton National Detective Agency, Chicago branch. The saloon went quiet. The Pinkertons were legendary mercenaries of the law, hired by robber barons to break strikes and hunt down enemies. "A long way from Chicago, Mr. Thorne," Thaddeus said, his interest piqued. "I am looking for a man," Thorne said, pulling a photograph from his satchel. It was an old tintype, showing a young, clean-shaven man in a high-collared suit. William Vanderhoven III, heir to the Vanderhoven steel fortune, presumed dead 5 years ago. His uncle, however, believes he may have survived and fled west. There is a substantial reward for his apprehension. Thaddeus looked at the photo. The jawline was the same. The eyes. He pictured the simple mountain man, silent Gideon, and the way he had handled that Winchester rifle. He remembered the perfect diction Gideon had used when he thought no one was listening. A slow, cruel smile spread across Thaddeus's face. The pieces clicked into place. The bags of raw silver. The fortified cabin. The charade of the simpleton. "Mr. Thorne," Thaddeus said, gesturing to his booth, "let me buy you a drink. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance, and I believe he currently possesses something, or rather, someone, that belongs to me." An unholy alliance was born in the smoky air of the Gilded Spur. Thaddeus provided the local geography and the manpower. Jasper Thorne provided the federal authority and the ruthlessness of the Pinkertons. Up on Argent Peak, Gideon felt the shift in the wind before it arrived. It was a deep-seated instinct, honed by years of living on the run. "We need one last run to town before the deepest snows set in," Gideon said over breakfast, his brow furrowed. "We need lamp, oil, and flour. And I need to send a letter to a contact in San Francisco about smelting equipment." Loretta felt a cold knot of dread. Is it safe? Thaddeus has been quiet too long. Thaddeus is a bully, but he's terrified of the mountain in winter, Gideon assured her, strapping on his gun belt. "I'll go alone. It's faster. You stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He kissed her deeply, lingering longer than usual. "I'll be back by nightfall, Copper Queen." Loretta watched him ride the big mule down the treacherous path until he disappeared into the pines. The silence of the cabin, usually comforting, felt oppressive today. Gideon made good time down the mountain. Oakhaven was hunkered down against the cold, smoke pumping from every chimney. He tied the mule outside the general store, pulling his hat low and hunching his shoulders, adopting the persona of Silent Gideon. He entered the store. It was quiet. Too quiet. The clerk was nowhere to be seen. Gideon sensed the trap a second too late. The back door kicked open. "Don't move, Mr. Vanderhoven." Gideon spun, his hand going for his pistol, but he froze. Jasper Thorne stood there, holding a sleek, nickel-plated revolver aimed squarely at Gideon's chest. Behind Thorne stood Thaddeus Blackwood, grinning like a wolf over a fresh kill, flanked by 4 deputies with shotguns. "William Vanderhoven," Thorne repeated, his voice icy. You are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and the attempted murder of your uncle, Cornelius van der Hoven. Lies, Gideon growled, dropping the simpleton act. My uncle murdered my father and tried to kill me. That's for a court in Pennsylvania to decide, Thorne said. If you survive the train ride back. Thaddeus stepped forward, snatching Gideon's gun from its holster. Look at him, the great mountain man, just a rich boy playing dress-up. Thaddeus leaned in close, his breath reeking of whiskey. Don't worry about Loretta. I'll take good care of her, and that cabin of yours. I'm very interested to see how a trapper affords such luxury. Gideon lunged, roaring with rage, but the deputies were on him instantly, clubbing him to the ground with the butts of their shotguns. Darkness took him. Back on the mountain, Loretta paced. Night had fallen, and Gideon hadn't returned. The wind howled outside, sounding like human screams. Suddenly, there was a pounding on the heavy oak door. "Loretta, open up!" It was Thaddeus's voice. She grabbed the carbine, her heart hammering. "Go away, Thaddeus! Where is Gideon? Gideon is gone, my dear!" Thaddeus shouted over the wind. "The law came for him. He's a wanted man, a murderer from the East. They've taken him away in chains. You're lying. Am I?" Thaddeus laughed. "He lied to you about everything else, didn't he? Open the door, Loretta. The sheriff sent me to escort you back to town before you freeze up here alone. It's over." Loretta backed away from the door. She knew, with sickening certainty, that Thaddeus had won this round. Gideon was gone. But as she looked around the cabin, at the books, the maps of the silver lode, the life they had started to build, her despair turned into a cold, hard fury. She remembered Gideon's words, "When the time is right, you will be the Copper Queen." Thaddeus began to throw his shoulder against the door. The heavy wood groaned. Loretta levered around into the chamber of the carbine. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was Mrs. William van der Hoven, and she was sitting on an empire that Thaddeus Blackwood would never touch. The wind outside the cabin didn't just howl. It screamed, a banshee wail that tore through the pass and rattled the heavy beams of the roof. But inside, the silence was worse. It was the silence of a held breath, the suspended second before a dam breaks. Loretta van der Hoven, stood in the center of the room. She was trembling, but not from the biting cold that seeped through the chinking. She was vibrating with a terrified, crystalline focus. She looked at the heavy oak door, watching the iron brackets groan under the assault from the other side. Thud. The wood splintered. Thud. The heavy locking bar, hewn by Gideon's hands, began to crack. "Open it! Loretta!" Thaddeus Blackwood's voice was muffled by the wind but distinct in its malice. "Do not make me burn this shack down with you inside." Loretta didn't answer. She moved with the silent, frantic efficiency of a trapped animal turning to fight. She looked at the carbine resting on the table. It was heavy, cold, and lethal. But she knew Thaddeus. He wouldn't come alone, or if he did, he would come with his pistol drawn, ready to fire at the first sign of resistance. If she reached for the rifle too early, she died. If she hesitated, she died. She needed an equalizer. Her eyes darted to the corner of the kitchen where Gideon kept his mining supplies. A small wooden crate stamped Nobel's blasting powder sat near the floor. Too dangerous. She didn't want to bring the mountain down on her head. But next to it was the sack of baking flour and a tin of finely ground coal dust Gideon used for the forge. A memory flashed. Gideon, weeks ago, showing her the science of the mines. "Dust is more dangerous than dynamite, Loretta. If the air gets thick enough with coal dust or flour, and you introduce a spark, the very air becomes fire." The door hinges shrieked. A fissure of gray daylight appeared as the wood gave way. Loretta grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove. She scooped a mound of flour and a handful of coal dust into it, mixing them frantically. She set the pan on the floor, 5 feet from the door, directly in the path of the draft. She struck a sulfur match, the smell sharp and stinging, and held it ready. "Last warning!" Thaddeus roared. With a final, thunderous crash, the locking bar snapped. The door flew open, rebounding off the interior wall with violence that shook the floorboards. The storm rushed in, a vortex of snow and freezing air, and with it came Thaddeus Blackwood. He looked like a demon rising from the ice, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, his face twisted in a rictus of triumph. In his right hand, a heavy Colt peacemaker was leveled at her chest. In his left, he held a kerosene lantern, the flame flickering wildly in the gale. He stepped across the threshold, his boots crunching on the floorboards. He saw Loretta standing by the stove, her hands empty, looking small and defeated. "Smart girl," Thaddeus sneered, kicking the door partially shut behind him to cut the wind. The lantern light danced, casting long, jumping shadows against the logs. I told you, Loretta. The bank always wins. He took another step. Where is the deed? And the claim map? I burned them. Loretta lied, her voice barely a whisper. You're lying. Thaddeus grinned, his teeth yellow in the lantern light. You're too pragmatic for that. You kept them. You thought you could trade them for your life. He raised the pistol. But the market value on your life has dropped to 0. He took the final step. Loretta flicked the match. She didn't throw it at him. She dropped it into the skillet on the floor, just as the draft from the still open crack in the door swirled the light, powdery mixture up into a cloud. The reaction was instantaneous. W.H. It wasn't the sharp crack of an explosive. It was the roar of a dragon. The suspended dust ignited in a flash fire, a rapidly expanding sphere of orange flame and pressurized heat. It consumed the oxygen in the entryway in a split second. Thaddeus screamed. The concussion slammed into him like a physical blow, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward against the doorframe. The lantern flew from his hand, shattering against the wall, though the oil didn't catch. The dust explosion had sucked the air out of the room for a heartbeat. Thaddeus crumbled to the floor, clutching his face, his eyebrows and the front of his hair singed away, his eyes blinded by the intense flash. Loretta didn't freeze. She didn't watch him fall. The moment the flash subsided, she lunged for the table. Her hands found the cold steel of the Winchester carbine. She cycled the lever, clack, clack, chambering around with a sound that was louder than the storm. Thaddeus was groaning, rolling on his side, trying to blink away the blindness. His hands scrabbled on the floorboards, searching for his dropped pistol. Touch it and you die, Loretta said. Her voice wasn't the voice of the seamstress. It wasn't the voice of the girl who had cried in the general store. It was low, flat, and utterly devoid of mercy. Thaddeus froze. He blinked rapidly, his vision clearing enough to see the blurry figure standing over him. The barrel of the Winchester was a black eye staring straight at his forehead. Loretta, he wheezed, holding up a shaking hand. Now, listen, get up, she commanded. Slowly. Kick the gun to me. Thaddeus obeyed, his movements jerky. He kicked the Colt across the floor. Loretta stepped on it, never lowering the rifle. You crazy witch, Thaddeus spat, touching his blistered forehead. Do you know what you've done? You've assaulted a civic leader. I've defended my home against an intruder, Loretta corrected. It doesn't matter, Thaddeus laughed, a high, hysterical sound that bordered on madness. You can kill me. Go ahead. It changes nothing. Thorne has Gideon. They're on the Midnight Express. By tomorrow, Gideon will be in a cell in Pittsburgh. By next week, he hangs for murder. And I still win. The claim isn't filed. I'll find the papers. You think you've won because you have the law? Loretta asked, her eyes narrowing. I bought the law, Thaddeus snarled. Jasper Thorne is a Pinkerton. He follows the money and the warrant. He doesn't care about your sob story. Then let's give him something he does care about. Loretta reached into the pocket of her apron with her free hand. She pulled out a heavy, iron key. Keeping the rifle trained on Thaddeus's heart, she backed toward the hidden hatch in the floorboards beneath the rug. She had unlocked it earlier, when she saw Thaddeus coming up the trail. She kicked the rug aside and lifted the loose board. There, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was the heavy leather-bound ledger Gideon had brought from the east. The Vanderhoven Steelworks master ledger. She held it up. Gideon told me everything, Thaddeus. This book? It proves the embezzlement. It proves Cornelius Vanderhoven paid the captain of the Lady of the Lake to sink the boat. It proves the money transfers to the accounts your bank manages. Thaddeus's face went pale, the soot standing out starkly against his white skin. He recognized the look of the book. He knew the danger of ink and paper. Thorne won't read it, Thaddeus said, though his voice wavered. He'll burn it. Pinkertons are mercenaries, but they are a business, Loretta said, remembering what Gideon had told her about the agency. They hate being played for fools, and they hate being accessories to murder when the press gets involved. If Thorne sees this, he has to act, or the Vanderhoven shareholders will dismantle his agency piece by piece. She threw a coil of rope at Thaddeus's feet. Tie your left wrist to your belt, she ordered. Tight. You can't be serious, Thaddeus stammered. The storm. We can't go down the mountain now. We'll freeze. Then walk fast, Loretta said, thumbing back the hammer of the rifle. Because Gideon is on that train, and I'm going to stop it. The descent from Argent Peak was a journey through the ninth circle of hell, frozen over. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against them with every step. Loretta rode Gideon's favorite mule, a beast named Ironhead, who possessed the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. A thick lasso was tied to the saddle horn, the other end secured around Thaddeus Blackwood's waist. He stumbled behind the mule, slipping on the icy scree, falling into drifts of snow that came up to his knees. His fine wool coat was torn, his hat lost to the wind miles back. Ice crystals formed in his mustache and on his eyelashes. "Loretta!" he screamed over the wind, his voice cracking. "Stop! I'll give you $10,000. I'll sign the bank over to you. Just let me go." Loretta didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the trail, her scarf wrapped around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. She was cold, bone-deep cold, but a fire burned in her chest that no blizzard could extinguish. Every time she thought of stopping, she pictured Gideon. She pictured his quiet strength, the way he brushed her hair, the way he had stood against the window defending her. He came back for me, she thought. He could have run, but he stayed to fight for this life. I will not let them take him. 20,000! Thaddeus wailed, falling face first into the snow again. The mule dragged him 3 feet before Loretta halted. She turned in the saddle, looking down at the shivering, pathetic figure of the man who had terrified Oakhaven for a decade. "You don't get it, Thaddeus," she shouted over the gale. "You think money is the only power in the world. You think you can buy people like cattle, but you can't buy loyalty, and you can't buy love." "Love?" Thaddeus spat the word like poison as he scrambled to his feet. "Love warms the bed, Loretta. It doesn't stop a hanging. You're marching to your death. Thorn will shoot you on sight. Walk," she commanded, snapping the reins. The trail leveled out as they reached the timberline. The lights of Oakhaven twinkled below, blurred by the snowfall, and there, cutting through the valley like a jagged scar, was the whistle of the train. The Midnight Express. It was early. Panic flared in Loretta's chest. She kicked the mule into a trot. Thaddeus yelled as he was forced to run to keep from being dragged, slipping and sliding in the mud and slush of the lower elevation. "Faster, Ironhead!" she urged the mule. "Faster!" The Oakhaven station was a tableau of misery and industrial grit. The steam locomotive hissed and groaned, a black iron beast exhaling white clouds into the night. Lanterns swung from the platform roof, casting harsh yellow pools of light on the snow. A small crowd had gathered, despite the cold. Gossip in Oakhaven was a force of nature, and the arrest of the mountain man was the event of the year. Gideon sat on a bench near the luggage cart. He was a ruined man. His left eye was swollen shut, purple and angry. His lip was split. His hands were shackled in heavy iron cuffs, chained to the bench itself. He wore only his flannel shirt and vest, shivering slightly, but his one good eye was fixed on the mountain peaks shrouded in darkness. Jasper Thorne stood over him, checking a gold pocket watch. The Pinkerton agent looked immaculate, untouched by the grime of the town. "Board him," Thorne said to the deputies. "The water tank is full. We leave in 2 minutes. You're making a mistake, Thorne," Gideon rasped. His voice was weak, but steady. "Check the dates on the warrant. My uncle signed the affidavit before the audit was supposedly completed." "Save it for the judge, Mr. Vanderhoven," Thorne said dismissively. "I have a job to do." 2 deputies grabbed Gideon by the arms, hauling him to his feet. Gideon stumbled, the chains rattling. "Wait!" The shout came from the darkness beyond the platform lights. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. The crowd parted. Into the circle of light rode Loretta Vanderhoven. She looked wild, her hair escaping her scarf, her dress mud-spattered, the carbine resting across her lap. And behind her, stumbling, bruised, and bound like a dog, was Thaddeus Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the townsfolk. Thaddeus Blackwood, the king of Oakhaven, brought low by the seamstress. "Hold your fire!" Thorne shouted to the deputies, his hand hovering over his own weapon. He stared at the woman on the mule. "Mrs. Vanderhoven, I assume there is a reason you are dragging a prominent citizen through the mud?" "He's no citizen," Loretta cried, sliding off the mule. Her legs nearly gave out from exhaustion, but she forced herself to stand tall. She kept the gun trained on Thaddeus, but her eyes locked on Thorne. "And you are about to hang an innocent man for the crimes of a guilty one." "Mr. Thorne!" Thaddeus shrieked, seeing his salvation in the lawman. "She's mad! She tried to kill me! Shoot her!" "That man is a criminal! Shut up, Thaddeus!" Loretta yelled. She reached into her coat and pulled out the ledger. She held it up, the leather cover gleaming wet with snow. "You want the truth, Mr. Thorne?" Loretta walked forward, ignoring the deputy's shotguns leveled at her. "This is the personal ledger of Cornelius Vanderhoven. Gideon didn't steal it to hide his crimes. He stole it to prove his uncle's. She threw the book. It spun through the air and landed with a heavy thud at Thorn's feet. Thorn looked at the book. He looked at Gideon, whose face was a mask of desperate hope. He looked at Thaddeus, who was sweating despite the freezing cold. Slowly, deliberately, Thorn bent down and picked up the book. "Don't read it!" Thaddeus yelled, lunging forward, but the rope tied to the mule snapped taut, jerking him back. "It's a forgery! It's lies!" Thorn ignored him. He opened the book. He adjusted his spectacles. The station went silent, save for the huffing of the train. Thorn flipped through the pages. He was an accountant before he was a gunman. He knew what he was looking for. He saw the duplicate entries. He saw the payouts listed under incidentals. L. Superior Accident. He saw the massive transfers to the Blackwood Bank and Trust, Wyoming Territory. Thorn looked up. His gray eyes were unreadable. He looked at Thaddeus. "Mr. Blackwood," Thorn said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "According to this, you received a wire transfer of $50,000 from Cornelius Vanderhoven 3 days before his nephew's accidental disappearance." Thaddeus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "That is a substantial sum," Thorn continued, closing the book with a snap. "One might call it blood money." "It was an investment!" Thaddeus cried, his composure shattering. "I didn't know! I swear!" "You knew," Gideon said from the bench. "That's why you wanted the land. You knew I was here. You were waiting to finish the job." Thorn turned to the deputies. "Release the prisoner." "Now wait a minute," the sheriff stammered. "Blackwood pays our wages. I am a federal agent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency." Thorn barked, drawing himself up to his full height. "And I am declaring this a crime scene involving interstate conspiracy and attempted murder. Release him, or I will arrest you all for obstruction of justice." The deputies scrambled to unlock Gideon's cuffs. Thaddeus's eyes darted around. He saw his empire crumbling. He saw the jail cell waiting. He saw the end of everything. Madness took him. "No!" Thaddeus screamed. He lunged at the nearest deputy, a young boy named Billy. Thaddeus ripped the shotgun from the boy's surprised hands and spun around, leveling the twin barrels, not at Thorn, but at Loretta. "If I go down, you go to hell!" Thaddeus roared. Time seemed to slow. Loretta couldn't raise her carbine fast enough. Thorn was too far away. Crack. A single shot rang out. Sharp, precise. Thaddeus didn't fire. The shotgun in his hands exploded in a shower of wood and metal splinters. He screamed, dropping the ruined weapon, clutching his numb, vibrating hands. Every head turned. Gideon stood by the bench. He had snatched the heavy Colt revolver from the sheriff's holster the moment his hands were free. He stood tall, the gun smoking in his hand. He hadn't aimed. He hadn't hesitated. He had fired from the hip with the supernatural instinct of a man protecting his heart. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a king. Gideon walked forward, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. He walked past Thorn, past the deputies, straight to Loretta. He dropped the gun in the snow and took her face in his bruised hands. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you," Loretta sobbed, dropping her rifle and collapsing into his arms. "We're partners. 50-50. Gideon looked over Loretta's shoulder at Thaddeus, who was now being handcuffed by Thorn. "Take him away," Gideon said softly, "and tell my uncle I'm coming for him, not with a gun, but with this." He pointed to the ledger in Thorn's hand. Thorn tipped his bowler hat. "I believe the United States Attorney will be very interested in this reading material, Mr. Vanderhoven. I'll see that you have safe passage to Pittsburgh to testify." Thorn dragged a weeping Thaddeus toward the train car meant for prisoners. As he passed Gideon, Thaddeus looked up, his spirit broken. "Who are you?" Thaddeus whispered. Gideon pulled Loretta closer, the warmth of her body seeping into his frozen bones. "I'm the quiet man," Gideon said, "and you should have let me sleep." The trial of Cornelius Vanderhoven was the scandal of the decade in Pennsylvania. With the ledger as the smoking gun and Jasper Thorn as the star witness, the steel tycoon's defense crumbled. He died in prison 2 years later. But William Gideon Vanderhoven didn't stay in the smog of the East. He sold his controlling interest in the steelworks for a sum that made the bankers in New York dizzy, and he took the first train back to Wyoming. He returned to the woman who had saved his life. They didn't leave the mountain. Instead, they tamed it. The Cross and Higgins Mining Company became the largest silver producer in the territory. But it was different from other mines. There were no strikes because the workers owned shares. There was no hunger because Loretta built a town in the valley, New Oakhaven, that boasted a hospital, a school, and a library that rivaled those in Boston. Thaddeus Blackwood spent 15 years in the territorial penitentiary breaking rocks. When he was released, old and broken, he returned to Oakhaven to find it unrecognizable. He died a pauper in a charity ward funded by the Vanderhoven estate. Loretta and Gideon built a life that became legend. They built a grand timber mansion in the valley, but they kept the old cabin on the ridge exactly as it was. Every anniversary, they would ride up there. Gideon on his mule, Loretta on hers, and sit by the fire. They had 3 sons and a daughter. The daughter, named Sarah, grew up to be as fierce as her mother. One winter evening, years later, Sarah asked her mother, "Mama, were you scared when you went up the mountain to marry the wild man?" Loretta looked at Gideon, whose hair was now streaked with gray, but whose blue eyes still burned with that intense, quiet love. He was reading a book by the fire, his scarred hand resting on the head of a sleeping wolfhound. "I was terrified," Loretta admitted, smoothing her daughter's hair. "I thought my life was over. I thought I was walking into the dark." "But what did you find?" Loretta smiled, the firelight catching the gold band on her finger. "I found that the dark isn't empty, Sarah. Sometimes that's where the diamonds are hiding. And sometimes," she looked at Gideon, who looked up and winked, "the beast is just a prince waiting for the right reason to fight." They lived out their days, not as the Baron and the Baroness, but as Gideon and Loretta. They were the royalty of the West, crowned not by gold, but by the iron-strong bond forged in the coldest winter Wyoming had ever seen. And in Oakhaven, nobody ever laughed at a stranger again. And that, my friends, is the legend of Loretta and Gideon. A story that proves you should never judge a book by its cover, or a man by his coat. From a desperate marriage of convenience to a battle for a hidden empire, they showed that true power comes from loyalty and courage. If you enjoyed this Wild West saga and want to see more stories where the underdog takes it all, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good romance twist, and subscribe so you never miss our next epic story. Thanks for watching.